There is a calculation people do quietly, usually late at night. You count the years behind you, count the ones you think are left, and weigh them against the life you thought you would have by now. And a verdict forms. I missed it. The window is closed. My best years are gone, and I spent them on nothing. Maybe those years went to an addiction, or a relationship you knew was wrong and stayed in anyway, or a depression that swallowed a decade, or an illness, or simply to drifting. A long stretch where nothing terrible happened and nothing meaningful did either. And the cruelest part is that the verdict does not feel like a lie. It feels like honesty. It is not. It is a lie. And one scripture attacks from more directions than almost any other. Part of why it feels so true is that you have been measuring with a ruler God never wrote. A scoreboard that says your value peaks young, that if you have not made it by a certain age, you have missed your chance, that what follows your prime is only decline. The despair is real. The ruler is false. So let's take the whole thing apart, because the God of the Bible is not bound by your timeline, and he specializes in doing his best work with material everyone else had written off as wasted. Which brings us to the first lie inside the lie, that your best years are by definition your youngest ones. Scripture says almost precisely the opposite. Psalm 92 describes the person planted in the house of the Lord and says something we rarely notice. They still bear fruit in old age. They are ever full of sap and green. Still bearing fruit in old age, not coasting, not fading, not living off the memory of a fruitful decade long ago, still producing, still green, still growing. That is not a picture of decline. It is a picture of a tree that keeps yielding. And Paul writes something even more striking to a group of suffering Christians. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. Read that carefully, because it describes two opposite trajectories running through the same person at the same time. Yes, the body ages. The energy fades, the face changes, the knees complain. That part of the scoreboard is real, and it moves in one direction. But there is another self inside you, and it is moving in the other direction, being renewed day by day, growing rather than diminishing. And the things that grow in that inner self are precisely the things that make a life worth something. Wisdom, depth, patience, compassion, discernment, the capacity to sit with someone in pain, the kind of faith that has been tested and held. Those things are not just the products of youth, they are the products of years, and often, specifically, of hard years. A person who has never failed cannot help someone in the ruins the way a person who has been in the ruins can. By God's accounting, your best years, in the only sense that lasts, may genuinely still be ahead of you. The second lie is the one that stings the sharpest. It is too late for me. And here the Bible does something almost comical in its consistency. It is filled, from beginning to end, with people whose stories started late, so late that by every reasonable human measure, their window had slammed shut decades earlier. Consider Abraham. God called him to leave everything and begin a whole new life at 75 years old. 75. At an age when most people are decades past starting anything, God said, "Go." And then he promised him a son, and Abraham waited 25 more years for that promise, until he was 100 years old and Sarah was 90, and everyone involved had long since accepted that this particular door was permanently closed. And that is precisely when Isaac was born. The entire nation of Israel, the whole line that leads to Christ, came out of a couple whose biological window had not just closed, but had been shut for decades. Or consider Moses, whose life divides almost too neatly into 3 parts of 40 years. The first 40 he spent as a prince in Egypt, educated, powerful, positioned, and he blew it, murdering a man and fleeing into the desert as a fugitive. The second 40 he spent in the middle of nowhere in Midian, tending someone else's sheep, an obscure shepherd with a criminal past, watching his prime disappear over a horizon of sand. If anyone in Scripture had grounds to conclude his life was wasted, it was Moses at 79, having thrown away his opportunity at 40 and spent the next 4 decades in obscurity with nothing to show for it. And it was at 80 years old, at the end of a life anyone would call spent, that God spoke from a burning bush and gave him the assignment that would define human history. Moses' entire ministry, everything we remember him for, happened after the age at which most people have long since retired. The pattern keeps repeating. Caleb, at 85 years old, walked up to Joshua and said, "I am still as strong today as I was in the day Moses sent me. So now, give me this hill country," asking, in his mid-80s, for the hardest territory to conquer, the one with giants in it. That is not a man managing his decline. Noah was 500 years old when God gave him the assignment that saved the human race. Zechariah and Elizabeth were advanced in years and long past hope of children when God gave them a son who would prepare the way for the Messiah. And in the temple in Jerusalem, there were 2 old people, Simeon and Anna, who had spent decades. Anna was 84 and had been widowed for most of her life, worshiping in the temple night and day with fasting and prayer, waiting for a promise that must have looked like it would never come. And then, one ordinary day, a poor young couple walked in with a baby, and the moment those 2 elderly people had been waiting their whole lives for finally arrived. Their defining hour came at the very end. If God had a rule about windows closing, none of these stories would exist. He does not appear to have that rule. Jesus told a parable that makes the same point with almost offensive generosity. A landowner hires workers for his vineyard at dawn, and then again at 9, at noon, at 3, and then at 5 in the afternoon. With barely an hour of daylight left, he goes out and finds men still standing idle, and he hires them too. And at the end of the day, he pays them all the same full day's wage, starting with the ones who came last. The men who worked all day are furious about it. But look at what that parable says to anyone who believes they came to God too late. The 11th hour workers were not penalized for the hours they had missed. They were not given a reduced wage proportional to their small contribution. They received the full, generous, undiminished gift, the same as those who had been there since sunrise. Because God's generosity is not calculated on a pro rata basis against your years of service. He is not going to hand you a smaller portion of himself because you found him at 50 instead of 15. The thief on the cross had less than a day of following Jesus, and he was told, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Full entry, full welcome, no discount for a lifetime of waste. Coming late does not mean receiving less, but there is a deeper ache underneath. It's too late, and it is the third lie, that the years already lost are simply gone, subtracted, unrecoverable, a permanent hole in the ledger. And this is where God makes one of the most extraordinary promises in all of Scripture. Through the prophet Joel, to a people whose land had been stripped bare by a plague of locusts, swarm after swarm eating everything, leaving nothing but bare stalks, God says this, "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten." Sit with the strangeness of that promise. He does not say, "I will forgive you for the years the locusts ate." He does not say, "I will help you make peace with the loss." He says, He will restore the years. God claims the ability to give back time itself, not by rewinding a clock, but by so redeeming and multiplying what remains that the loss is genuinely made up. And whatever your locusts were, addiction, illness, a destructive relationship, a decade of drifting, your own stubborn refusal to listen, the promise stands over them. This is the same God of whom Paul writes that, for those who love God, all things work together for good. Not some things, not the respectable parts of your history. All things, including the wasted parts, the shameful parts, the years you would erase if you could. He does not merely forgive the waste and move on. He picks it up and works it into something. And nothing demonstrates that more clearly than what God was actually doing during Moses' so-called wasted years. Look again at those 40 years in Midian. From the outside, they were the dead middle of his life, a fugitive tending another man's sheep in a wilderness, achieving nothing, building nothing, forgotten. But consider what those years actually produced. For 4 decades, Moses learned the terrain of that wilderness, the water sources, the passes, the seasons, the way to move a flock through a desert and keep them alive. He learned the patience of shepherding stubborn animals that wander and complain and refuse to be led. And then God called him to take a nation of 2 million stubborn, complaining, wandering people through that exact wilderness for 40 years. The wasted decades were not wasted at all. They were the training. Every skill he needed for the assignment of his life was forged in the years he must have assumed were his punishment. God was not idling those years away. He was building the man in them. And that ought to change how you look at your own lost stretch. The years you would call empty may have been quietly forming things in you: endurance, humility, compassion for people in the pit, because you have been in the pit, a hard-won knowledge of what does not satisfy, that no successful, uninterrupted, impressive life could ever have produced. You may be looking at your preparation and calling it your waste. And if that is not enough to break the equation of hidden equals wasted, consider the life of Jesus himself. He lived roughly 33 years on this earth. And his public ministry, everything we have 4 Gospels to record, every sermon, every healing, every word we build our faith on, occupied only the last 3 of them, which means that the Son of God, who came with the most urgent mission in the history of the universe, spent approximately 30 years in complete obscurity. 3 decades in an unremarkable village in a region people openly mocked, working as a carpenter, making yokes and doors and repairing furniture, with nothing recorded, nothing published, nothing that any biographer would have thought worth writing down. Roughly 90% of the earthly life of Jesus produced no headline at all. If anyone in history had grounds to feel the pressure of a ticking clock, of a prime being squandered on the ordinary, it was him. And yet, at his baptism, before he had preached a single sermon or performed a single miracle, the Father tore open the heavens and said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." The Father declared his delight over 30 years of sawdust and silence. Whatever else that means, it demolishes the idea that a life is only valuable when it is visible. God was not waiting for Jesus to get productive in order to be pleased with him, and he is not waiting on you either. Which leads to the 4th lie, the one that keeps people from ever starting again. Even if it's not too late in principle, God could never use someone with my history. And the honest answer to that is to simply look at who God has already used. Moses was a murderer and a fugitive. David, the man after God's own heart, committed adultery and arranged a man's death to cover it, and God still built the Messiah's line through him. Peter denied Jesus 3 times with curses on the worst night of his life, and weeks later was preaching the sermon that launched the church. And then there is Paul, who did not merely waste his early years, he spent them actively destroying the very thing he would later give his life to build, dragging Christians from their homes, approving executions. Listen to how he describes it. I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. He never pretended his past was anything other than what it was. He simply refused to let it be the last word, because grace had gotten there first. Or consider the man Jesus met in the region of the Gerasenes, a man who had lost years, maybe most of his adult life, to a torment so severe that he lived among the tombs, naked, screaming, cutting himself, chained by people who could not control him. By any measure, a life entirely consumed. And after Jesus healed him, that man begged to come along, and Jesus told him instead to go home and tell his own people what God had done. And he went and proclaimed it throughout the Decapolis, 10 cities, becoming one of the first missionaries in the Gospels. The man whose years had been devoured in the tombs became the messenger to an entire region, and the message he carried was made of those years. His ruined history was his testimony. And there is a king almost no one preaches about, whose story may be the most extreme case of wasted years in the entire Bible. Manasseh became king of Judah at 12 years old and reigned 55 years, longer than any king in Judah's history. And he spent those decades doing more evil than perhaps any ruler before him. He rebuilt the pagan altars his father had torn down. He set up idols inside the temple of God itself. He practiced sorcery, consulted mediums, and sacrificed his own sons in the fire. 55 years of it. And then, near the end of his life, the Assyrians came, put a hook in his nose and bronze shackles on his wrists, and dragged him away to Babylon. And there, in chains, at the ruined end of a ruined life, Scripture records something almost unbelievable. And when he was in distress, he entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God was moved by his entreaty and heard his plea and brought him again to Jerusalem. God heard him. God restored him. And Manasseh spent his final years tearing down the very altars he had spent 5 decades building. 55 years of catastrophic waste. And God still received him, still restored him, still gave him something worth doing with what was left. If Manasseh's account was not closed, yours is not either. But underneath all 4 of these lies is the deepest error of all, and until it is corrected, none of the encouragement above will fully land. It is this: you are measuring your life by output, and God measures it by something else entirely. When you conclude your life has been wasted, what you almost always mean is that you did not produce enough, not enough achievement, not enough recognition, not enough visible impact, not enough of the things that show up on a resume or an obituary. But that is not the measure God uses. Jesus asked the question that dismantles the whole scoreboard. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Think about what that means. A person can win at every single thing the world measures: the career, the wealth, the influence, the impressive decades, and, in the only accounting that ultimately matters, have wasted their entire life. And the reverse is equally true. A person can produce almost nothing the world would record, live quietly and unremarkably, be known to only a handful of people. And if they knew God and loved the people in front of them, they will hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." Not "Well done, good and successful servant." Faithful. The measure was never how much you produced in your prime. It was whether you were His and whether you loved. Which means the truly wasted life is not the one with lost years. It is the one lived apart from God, however full its calendar was. And it means your quiet, interrupted, unimpressive years may be far less wasted than you have been telling yourself, if God was in them at all. So what do you do with the years that are actually gone? Because they are gone, and no amount of encouragement changes the calendar. Moses himself gives the answer. In a psalm he wrote, "Teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom." Numbering your days is not a call to grieve the ones behind you. It is a call to be honest about the ones in front of you and to spend them well. You cannot get the lost decade back, but you can do something with everything that remains. And here is the plain arithmetic that the late-night version never includes. Today is the youngest you will ever be again. Every day you spend mourning the years you lost is another day added to the pile you are mourning. At some point, the only sane response is to stop counting backward and start planting. Paul, who had more wasted years to grieve than most, wrote the strategy in a single line. Forgetting what lies behind and straining forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal. He does not say the past did not matter. He says he refuses to keep staring at it while the road ahead is still open. The best time to have given your life fully to God may indeed have been 20 years ago. The second best time has never stopped being right now. So if you are the person doing that quiet arithmetic, adding up the wasted years, subtracting them from what you hoped for, arriving at a verdict of too late, hear the actual math. Your years are not beyond the reach of the God who restores what the locusts ate. Your history is not more ruined than a murderer's, a persecutor's, a denier's, or a king who burned incense to idols for 55 years and was still heard when he finally prayed. Your window has not closed on a God who called a man at 80 and gave a couple a baby at 100 and handed an 84-year-old widow the moment she had waited a lifetime for. And your quiet, hidden, unproductive stretch is not evidence of a wasted life to a God whose own son spent 30 years in a carpenter's shop and heard the heavens open in delight over him before he had accomplished a single visible thing. The verdict you reached at 2 a.m. was not honesty. It was a lie told with a false ruler by an accountant who does not know the God he is doing the math about. Hand him what is left. It is more than enough for him to work with. And he has never once, in the whole history of the world, been handed a life he could not redeem. Maybe the most useful thing you could do right now is put the calculator down. Not forever, just long enough to notice that the years ahead of you are still unwritten, and that the God who restores what the locusts ate has never been impressed or discouraged by anyone's timeline. If someone came to mind while you were listening, a friend, a parent, a sibling who talks about their life in the past tense, send this to them today. Because people carrying this particular lie almost never say it out loud, and it eats them quietly. And I'd genuinely like to know, what's one thing you still want to do with the years you have left? One thing you assumed had passed you by. Put it in Jesus' hands. Say it out loud. Because the moment you name a future, you've already stopped believing your story is over. It isn't. Not even close. Go and live the rest of it. God bless you.